Welcome, everyone. It is May 2nd, 2025. We are ICUJP, proud to have every one of you here in person, as well as those watching this recording on another date and time. ICUJP has been at this work for over 23 years, meeting every Friday morning, over 1,000 webinars, only a few days off for holidays, because we're committed to the vision that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. That's what we're committed to, and we're grateful to everybody who joins us. I'll say at the very top that we depend on our friends and strangers to be generous in their financial support. In the notice you received today to come here, there's a link to make a donation. You can always go to icujp.org. It's wonderful if you can make a standing monthly donation. It helps us plan. We're a small, struggling group, but we do have some fixed expenses and a part-time staff. So we're grateful for your help whenever you can afford it. So let's turn to Greg and her reflection.
I am honored to serve on this board. I feel I really belong here since I, in fact, do not believe in a God. I am an existentialist, a secular humanist. And the reason I come here is I believe in the possibility of humans, and these are the most wonderful humans. Gives me hope every Friday to meet with you. So that's my reason for being here. And I want to tell you a reflection from existentialism. I'm not going to read you a quote because I'm going to make this short to give you back the time we accidentally lost. I am just going to say, I think it will comfort your heart to read Albert Camus' book, The Myth of Sisyphus. It's not long. Its lesson is there is great joy in pushing the boulder up the hill over and over again, even though it rolls down. Because existentialism is, who are you in the face of overwhelming loss and death? How do you exist in the face of what's happening in Gaza? You roll the ball up every day, even though it rolls down, and that is our joy, and that is what these humans do. So I'm not going to give my reflection. I was going to read, but people can find Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. Don't read a summary of it. They all get it wrong. If you have time in your heart, that's my reflection. There is joy in endless failure because of who you are in the presence of evil, your existence. Thank you, and be well.
Oh, that's lovely, Greg. If you had something prepared in writing, you can share it with Rick and we can push it out as well, because we don't want to lose your wisdom.
I was going to read from Albert Camus, and there's no point in reading to literate people when we need the time. So I'm simply going to say it gives me hope. And if you need hope, I'm not saying it's a panacea, you might want to dip in, because you might feel deeply validated when you roll the same ball up the same hill tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. I've always wished that Sisyphus each time was incrementally making it a little farther up the mountain. Okay, let's move right along. And Rick will introduce Odeliya.
Thank you very much, folks, for joining us this morning. Speaking of rolling the ball up the hill, I know some of you had a little bit longer trek than normally. So we appreciate you being here. And we were connected to Odeliya and the Friends Committee on National Legislation by our esteemed board member, Anthony Manousis. And FCNL is a lobbying arm, essentially, for the Quakers, for Friends. And the values that FCNL reflects as they approach Congress and as they approach other parts of the U.S. government is to seek a world free of war and the threat of war, seek a society with equity and justice for all, seek a community where every person's potential may be fulfilled, and to seek a earth restored. So in that light, we have a talk from Odeliya Matter, who's a program associate on Middle East policy at FCNL. And she graduated from Sapir College in Sderot, Israel, with a bachelor's degree in journalism. And she also served as the field and media coordinator for Negev Consensus Forum for Civil Inequality, and working on civil rights and equality for residents of the Negev, and is also a teaching fellow with the Forum for Regional Thinking. And that's a think tank to bring about change in the way the Israeli public perceives the Middle East, and encouraging critical thought and a complex discourse about the region. And now she, with the FCNL, she's lobbying Congress on promotion of sustainable and long-sighted solutions for Middle East deprived of just those for ideas and concepts for far too long. So, Odeliya, the floor is yours, and if everybody else can go on mute, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Rick, and everyone here. What a pleasure to meet you all at the top of your morning. The dedication to come to a call on a Friday morning is inspiring for me, as is Sisyphus. And I think that was a really great reflection, because I think it goes without saying, we are up against a steeper and steeper and steeper mountain. You know, if under the Biden administration, it seemed like the mountain ahead was steep, this administration is all the steeper. So before I dive in, and I carry Sisyphus's story with me, and I have been for years, I'll give you a bit of background on where I come from and what brought me to work at FCNL in the first place, and to speak to y'all today. So I was born in Jerusalem to Jewish, formerly American parents, what some would call a mixed household, in the sense of my mom is a very progressive, open-minded kind of flower child. She herself was a cantor, a Jewish cantor, and a teacher of cantorial studies at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And my father considers himself modern Orthodox and has very conservative, right-wing Zionist views. So this is kind of the household I was raised in, and I was very influenced by both of these approaches to the place I was living in. They both, what is called, made Aliyah, moved to Israel when they were in their late 20s, early 30s from Florida, from Miami, Florida, and then eventually settled down in Jerusalem, where me and my older sister, Revital, were born. But when I grew up in this area of Jerusalem, it's East Jerusalem, it's on the cusp. My neighborhood was on the cusp between Jewish Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem being predominantly settled by Jewish Israelis, with East Jerusalem having residents, Palestinian residents, who are basically stateless people. They don't belong to the Israeli government. They don't have citizenship or voting rights to the Israeli government, which dictates how their very lives look. But they also don't belong to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They are victims of the divide and conquer approach of, predecessing Israeli governments, and they don't have access to full basic human rights. They don't have access to garbage and waste disposal, and sometimes to electricity. They don't have access to freedom of movement. They can't travel abroad without special permissions from the Israeli government and military, which very often they do not receive. It's very hard for my previous neighbors, to have permits to build their homes and expand as one's family does, or they don't have rights to the land that they used to own. I grew up beyond the green line in what I learned in my late 20s is actually a settlement. So my entire life growing up, I didn't know that I was a settler on Palestinian-owned lands. And I just want to give you this kind of visceral image of the kind of upbringing I had. We lived in a house, in an apartment. There was a backyard exit to our apartment, and there were a few hedges, and beyond those hedges was East Jerusalem, or Palestinian East Jerusalem. I knew none of what I know today about their access to basic rights, which I had full access to. I knew none of the history of Palestinian of oppression by the Israeli government. I knew none of the sort of displacement, none of the Nakba. I knew nothing of the families, just the families who lived there. And we did not have neighborly connections with these people for my entire upbringing. And only at the age of 25 did I take a tour in this Palestinian village. It was across the street, basically, Jebel Muqabel, where I realized that they live in terrible claustrophobic concentration because Israel won't provide them access to their own lands, that I live on stolen land, and that there's a long history of this specific neighborhood and these specific people that I just only at the age of 25 gained access to. And I had to work really hard to make these connections, because I think Israel puts a lot of obstacles in place so an Israeli and a Palestinian will not communicate on a face-to-face basis. A bit more on what it's like to be raised as a Jewish Israeli is that research has shown over the course of the almost 8 decades of the existence of the state of Israel, there has been at the beginning in textbooks in the Israeli education system, there was very little portrayal of what they called Arabs, but what we know are Palestinian Arabs. Very little portrayal, and it was very stereotypical. It often kind of romanticized the kind of ethnic traditions, the camels, the food, nothing of the history, nothing of the solidarity, nothing of land ownership. And over the course of time, textbooks have been completely depleted of any representation of any Arab culture, tradition, or living on the land. So all this to say, growing up under the Israeli Education Department, I learned nothing about Palestinians in school. All that I learned was from my classmates and where they, the upbringing that they had received. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was often said in kind of a slur in a class or when a teacher would talk about the current events and situation unrolling, death to Arabs. That was a quote that I would hear often in my school by fellow students. And that to me always made me really uncomfortable because of the history of my family and the generalizations and what had been bestowed upon my family and their history. But that was a common saying, in the vicinity of my upbringing under the Israeli Education Department. And very often teachers wouldn't interrupt those sentiments. They would kind of let it happen, let it slip. Later on in life, all Israelis join mandatory military service unless they're smart enough or have enough money to find their way out of the system. I was neither of those. I tried to actually refuse military service, but I didn't want to sit in jail. And it was really uncommon for the people around me to refuse military service at the time. I did refuse to join a combat unit, an elite combat unit, where I was offered a position to design camouflage for units that were entering in Lebanon. And I refused that service. Instead, I was put in the education unit, where I was teaching a 60-hour course to soldiers who had made Aliyah, so moved to Israel and are serving in the army, The 60-hour course was called Zionism. So I was teaching a history, a militarized history of the state of Israel from the destruction of the Second Temple to 2014 when I was serving and when there was a war in Gaza. This taught me a lot, obviously, but I did want to, backtrack for a second. You grow up under the Israeli Education Department. The next place where you could possibly learn about Palestinians is actually via the military, where I was serving in uniform. Every Palestinian I had an interaction with, there was this really straightforward power dynamic between us. I posed a threat to them. They were threatening to me because of what I had learned was just to fear them. And a lot of other soldiers who were in combat units, their first, understanding of Palestinians was in interactions that might have been very violent. The third place where an Israeli Jewish person can learn about Palestinians is the media. I don't know if you have ever heard or seen, highlights from Israeli mainstream media, but let me tell you, it gives you absolutely nothing of humanity of these people. And I studied journalism in an Israeli institution under lead and top Israeli journalists. They were completely ignorant at best or completely racist towards Palestinians, their cause, human rights violations happening far before October 7th. And so along my kind of journey of understanding as just a truth seeker and a person who, Greg, I definitely relate to seeking humanity as a premise of my existence. I was raised in a Jewish household, but I was always really, really, really drawn by Jewish values of God being within everyone, of liberation, of our history of oppression and trying to unbind oppression elsewhere. The part of teaching the 60-hour course called Zionism, 6 hours were dedicated to Holocaust and World War II education. So learning and then teaching about the rise of fascism and witnessing in real time as I'm teaching these values, how it's happening around me, that kind of shook me to my core. So I pursued, meeting Palestinians where they are, visiting villages. I volunteered in some refugee camps in Lesvos in Greece for a while when I was traveling in Europe. And that's where I also met Palestinians from Gaza for the first time. That interaction I was denied that interaction my entire upbringing. And where I grew up was just an hour away from Gaza in a car. So my first interaction with a Gazan was in Greece. And those interactions were really life-changing. I then went to study environmental studies at this program called the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. It's the only studies program where Gazan students and Israeli students study together, as well as West Bankers, Jordanians, Egyptians, Moroccans, and some international students. So we built a strong friendship and community. And since then, I cannot look back. As an Israeli, I grew up in the system. I joined the military. I feel that I need to take responsibility and be accountable for my complicity in what has happened. And my Jewish faith compels me to act in a way that dignifies and sanctifies the life of every human being. So that is what brought me to where I am today. And very shortly, I joined the delegation of Palestinians and Israelis to Capitol Hill about 2.5 years ago. I interned through this program with Senator Van Hollen's office of Maryland, who I really admire, and I admire his work across the board today. And I met a lobbyist. His name is Hassan. He gave us a workshop, and I said, this guy is really down to earth. He's really friendly, but it seems like he gets things done. So I approached him and I asked him, how can I become a lobbyist? How can I do what you're doing? And he told me, you should apply to be my assistant at the Friends Committe on National Legislation. I applied, and then I joined in September 2023, a month before the war began. And this year, I feel like I could not have been anywhere more perfect to act in a way that I feel is effective, to use my voice as a Jewish Israeli and speak to Congress people and say that this is not protecting anyone right now. And FCNL has hired me for another year and will hire me for another year in July. So hopefully I'll be seeing more of you and you'll be seeing more of me in this field. Now, let me jump into what we've been doing at FCNL for the past year and a half. Like I said, I joined less than a month before the war began. So this has been all of my work for the last year and a half. October 7th, for me, what personally was really difficult, I lost some people that I know and loved, my ex-boyfriend, a high school friend, a fellow student studying journalism with me. And I knew several people who were taken hostage as well. When the war broke out, FCNL immediately condemned all violence towards civilians and called for a ceasefire immediately. Because, and this was something that I pushed the organization to do as well, I have lived under the Israeli government and I've been through wars with Gaza already. I lived Sapir, where I studied journalism, was a 10-minute drive from Gaza. And where I was living in Beersheba is southern Israel. I was under rocket fire for months of my life, since 2014 till I just moved to the United States. I know for a fact that there is no military solution to what was happening in Gaza, that there was no drinkable water in Gaza, that people had nothing to lose before October 7th. We need to find other ways of achieving goals and a diplomatic solution. Unfortunately, that is the farthest thing from the truth today in action, in the Israeli government and military's action. But we knew from day one that whatever happened to Israelis, this horrifying violence that affected every single Israeli you'll meet knows someone. No military solution is going to make Israelis safer. And Israel became on October 7th the most dangerous place for Jews in the entire world, under the most right-wing government Israel has ever seen. So October 7th happened, and within a couple of weeks, FCNL formed a coalition immediately. It was called the #CeasefireNow Coalition. This was the most used hashtag in 2023 in the world. And this coalition included faith orgs, there's Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and interfaith groups, humanitarian and human rights orgs operating on the ground in Gaza. We had labor groups, we had think tanks, we had feminist groups, we had groups identifying with different, identities in the United States, together forming this coalition to push for a ceasefire immediately, and a ceasefire that isn't conditioned with the complete annihilation of Hamas, because that is an unattainable goal. And immediately we started leading letters. We led a faith letter signed by over 26 church denominations. Those are denominations, some of whom identified on this call represent tens of millions of Americans. We also organized a national organizational letter. Over 100 organizations signed this. 2 members of Congress. We support a ceasefire now. We mobilized constituents via our website alone, over, I think, 1 million emails and calls to members of Congress. This is only the FCNL channel, with other organizations garnering hundreds of thousands, if not millions more emails and calls to these members, so that when we had lobby visits with them, they'd already been flooded with constituent support calling for a ceasefire. And of course, we had hundreds of lobby visits, and we had advocacy teams from around the country coming to DC several times for National Advocacy Days, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. These meetings, these emails, these advocacy days reached about 100 members of Congress that called for an unconditional ceasefire in Gaza since the beginning of the war. Here's FCNL's tracker I'm sending in the chat right now. And we stopped tracking this, a half a year into the war. We got 100 members of Congress calling for an unconditional ceasefire, with about 100 more calling for a ceasefire conditioned with things that we believed were unattainable. So that was really, really powerful to see the momentum of millions of Americans pushing that giant boulder up the steepest hill and creating that wedge in the Democratic Party and in Congress in general, saying, do you stand with peace, Or are you going to support military solutions that have never worked before? Next, after the ceasefire piece, and we keep beating that, unfortunately, for a year and a half, that is still the main ask that we are presenting. We're also moving to the humanitarian aid piece. So consistently throughout this year and a half, we've had to push members of Congress time and time again to state support or demands for the opening of aid access into Gaza. This unfortunately remains of the utmost importance right now, as Israel has instated a total blockade, legally, it's called a total blockade on Gaza, for over 2 months. So if we thought things could not get worse, this is the worst the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been since the beginning of the war. We have over 1.9 million people have been displaced, with nearly all homes and infrastructure completely destroyed in all of Gaza. There's virtually no healthcare system in place, as Israel has bombed hospitals and medical facilities and refuses to allow medical supplies and medicine into Gaza. We toured Congress. We accompanied doctors who'd come back from medical missions in Gaza, American doctors who'd served in places like southern Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine, war zones all over the world. And they all said unanimously that this was the worst humanitarian situation they have seen in their lives. Having members of Congress hear that testimony was moving, and also, devastating just to hear their testimonies on the Hill. The one small exception over this year and a half of medical, this war crime of collective punishment, of starving millions of people, of denying medical access into Gaza, was during the polio outbreak, where Israel allowed about a third to 2/3 of the population access to vaccinations. Not all of the vaccinations required to be fully immune. And of course, they boasted that they were allowing all this medical access, and where everyone who has been following the humanitarian situation in Gaza knows that this is because polio threatens Israelis when it's so close to the Israeli border. And that it's devastating because the polio outbreak can still happen, and not all of the population was vaccinated, and they're still being bombarded. So we are also seeing levels of famine and death by starvation as we speak. It's absolutely horrific. Now, amid this humanitarian catastrophe exacerbating day by day, last January, Israel put forward allegations against 12 of 30,000 employees of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. This is called UNRWA, and it is the backbone of humanitarian operations in Gaza. Most, if not all, humanitarian operators on the ground coordinate with them, as they have the most in-depth and decades-old infrastructure in place. And a couple more words on UNRWA as an agency. It was established by the UN General Assembly resolution in 1949 to carry out relief programs for Palestine refugees displaced in the Nakba until they received the right to return home. This was supposed to be a temporary agency that was supposed to care for hundreds of thousands of refugees created very quickly until they're allowed to return home, as the law of war and international law requires. But because this right was never realized, UNRWA still exists to this day. This, for Israel, is a huge threat because they see it as perpetuating the idea that Palestinian refugees are, in fact, refugees. With or without UNRWA, that idea, that sentiment, that value will exist. So what the Israeli government, as well as AIPAC, has been trying to do for years is undermine and annihilate the agency so that the concept of Palestinian refugeeship doesn't exist anymore. But it always will exist until they're allowed to return to their homes. So these allegations that Israel made are extremely political, and they came at a terrible, dire humanitarian time. And it claimed that these employees, 12 of 30,000 UNRWA employees, actively participated in Hamas's October 7th attacks. To this day, Israel has not provided feasible evidence to prove these claims. And as a knee-jerk reaction to these allegations made by Israel, both the Biden administration and Congress halted all US funding for UNRWA until last March, and then Trump issued an executive order that bans U.S. funding to UNRWA. UNRWA is the main donor to, the U.S. is the main donor to UNRWA amid 15 other countries. And Trump has indicated his administration will continue the suspension of U.S. funding to UNRWA. So I also want to say that after prompt action by UNRWA and the UN, as these allegations came in and additional facts have come to light, all of the other donor countries that suspended their support to UNRWA have resumed their funding, including allies to the US. That's the UK, the EU, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, Australia. So the US is the one stronghold that hasn't yet restored its funding to UNRWA. So as this was unfolding, we recognize the most important step we can make is to support UNRWA's vital work. And this is how we helped both the House and Senate offices introduce the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act. Last Congress, the House bill had over 70 co-sponsors. And this Congress, the bill was introduced in both the House and the Senate. I'm going to send a link to these two bills in the chat so you can kind of read more about them. But a couple of things I need to note on these bills is that we know that under the Trump administration, U.S. funding will not be restored. When it wasn't clear whether Biden or whether Harris or Trump would be elected, we knew that these bills, if Harris were to win the election, would push her to restore U.S. funding to UNRWA. So it was this kind of strategic move to do ahead of the elections. Under this administration, though, we know that U.S. funding to UNRWA will not be restored because he's literally cut off all foreign aid, let alone to Palestinians. But really in line with the Sisyphean philosophy, we need to keep the light on for this agency. We are up against entities investing millions over the course of years for the purpose of undermining and ruining UNRWA, but it is a decades-old institution and will continue carrying out crucial work with the help of other countries. And they also carry out work around the Middle East, like in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. And those countries need UNRWA for their regional stability. We also see these bills as a sort of safety net for UNRWA employees. When over 100 members of Congress show support and legitimacy for this agency that, Trump, the Israeli government, AIPAC are trying to undermine, maybe Israel will feel more pressure against bombing UNRWA schools and facilities, which they have with impunity so far. So that's on the humanitarian aid front up to now. I'll share later what we're doing on the humanitarian aid front, in the last weeks. But I do want to jump over to the weapons front. So I just want a heads up. I'm going to be talking about some wonky stuff next. Legislative strategy, why we think there's precedent for this to work. Again, long-term strategy in Congress-facing work. So I'm going to talk about the weapons piece. And the underlying message we have told our advocates, what we are pushing Congress to do is support aid, not arms, to the Middle East. So I covered the aid piece thus far. Now I'm going to cover the weapons piece. So the past year and a half has been a kind of whirlwind of actions and uphill battles. I'm sure folks here know there are groups with a lot of money who are profiting from this war, from this genocide. There, of course, is the Israeli government who has been carrying out war crimes daily with impunity and continued unconditional support from the US government. You also have lobby groups investing hundreds of millions of dollars to promote this unconditional support to Israel. I would name CUFI, which is Christians United for Israel, the Zionist evangelical lobby group, and AIPAC, the far right-wing pro-Israel Jewish lobby group. But also you have weapons manufacturers and companies profiting in the billions and billions over war. They all have mountains of resources, employees, DC real estate, Congress people's ears. But what we have and they do not is the people's support. And what I think is one of the most important messages we're amplifying time and time again to congressional offices is that according to polls, the majority of Americans want to stop sending weapons to Israel, both on the Democratic and Republican front. This is not helping US national security. This is wasting US taxpayers' dollars, and this undermines US global interests. As the world is watching us feed a monster that is inflicting what we're seeing in real time, mass starvation as a weapon of war. So a couple of legislative vehicles we've pushed so far at FCNL are the invoking Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act and joint resolutions of disapproval to block weapons to Israel. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about the precedent and why this would work on a long-term basis. So here's a brief overview of a successful, albeit long, process of legislative advocacy around the Saudi-led coalition war in Yemen. I'm fortunate enough to work in the Middle East Department at FCNL on a team of two, which is myself and my awesome boss that probably some of you know, Hassan Etayeb, who has led some incredible advocacy efforts on this with a coalition of a diversity of organizations calling to end U.S. complicity in the war and famine in Yemen. So in 2015, Saudi Arabia joined forces with the UAE and formed a coalition of 9 Arab countries backed by the United States, the UK, France, and Canada, and started a war. They framed the conflict in sectarian terms. They insisted that Iran was supporting the Houthis in Yemen. And in March 2015, they started conducting airstrikes and imposing a naval blockade against Yemen, indiscriminately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. So this might sound familiar to you. The UN estimated that by the end of 2021, the war in Yemen led to the deaths of at least 377,000 Yemenis and pushed over 16 million Yemenis to the brink of famine. And over 60% of the deaths were due to disruptions in access to food, water, and medicine. So the Saudi-led coalition received almost unwavering military support and weapon sales from the US, including targeting assistance and logistical support for these airstrikes, something called mid-air refueling for Saudi warplanes, spare parts transfers, billions of dollars in weapon sale. And congressional pressure, among other things, had led to a chain of events where in February 2021, Biden announced the US would end support for the Saudi-led coalition. And there was a truce between the Saudis and the Yemenis and the Houthis. The Saudis understood that after 6 years of bombing Yemen, they weren't getting anywhere. The Houthis will continue fighting back. And so they opted out. So there hadn't been Saudi airstrikes on Yemen for 3 years since President Biden announced that this would happen. And unfortunately, there are now direct US airstrikes on Yemen. Without the genocide in Gaza happening, I believe that this war on Yemen wouldn't happen because, of course, we know they're blocking key shipways until the genocide stops. So I just want to speak about the 3 key votes from 2016 to 2022 that ended U.S. direct support for Saudi mid-air refueling, of Saudi warplanes. In 2016, the administration notified Congress on a Saudi tank deal, and then Senators Durbin and Murphy forced a vote to block this tank sale. They didn't pass that first vote. They garnered 26 votes in favor. And, some members were fired up about this issue independently, while others were directly advocated by folks like yourselves. So the power was starting to build up. In August of 2018, it was discovered that a Saudi-fired bomb killed 40 children in Yemen, that was supplied by the United States. And also in 2018, the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. And because the war in Yemen escalated really badly, Senator Sanders pushed for Yemen War Powers resolution. Basically, this resolution seeks to remove the unauthorized involvement of U.S. armed forces in the war between the Saudi-led coalitions and the Houthis. The U.S. is not allowed to, technically, initiate war without congressional authorization. So a war powers resolution basically pushes the administration to ask for permission, and likely the Congress will say, no, you cannot start a war in Yemen. So that vote garnered 44 bipartisan supporters. In late December 2018, because the Yemen War Powers Resolution was already teed up, Sanders forced another vote and got 56 votes on this, with 7 Republicans on board. So the bill passed. And the same day, Trump stated that the Senate can't stop him from providing mid-air refueling to Saudi warplanes, and that they'll do it anyway. But simultaneously, behind the scenes, then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis pushed the Saudis to de-escalate strikes. Throughout this advocacy, there were also 3 joint resolutions of disapproval. These basically are resolutions that would block arms sales to any given country. So 3 had passed both chambers. They would block these weapon sales to the Saudis. And of course, Trump vetoed these resolutions. So altogether, during the Trump administration, 5 of the 8 bills he vetoes were related to war powers resolutions and joint resolutions of disapproval on weapons deal to the UAE to Saudis based around this war in Yemen. So eventually, the US did stop mid-air refueling to the Saudis without the bill passing first. The Saudis significantly reduced bombing of Yemen, and we saw a major reduction in hostilities. The UAE removed military presence in much of the region. So we saw this mechanism wherein policy can change without a bill passing. And then over the course of the next few years, more of these laws had passed. And, the pressure that Congress can actually generate on the administration, this happened under the Trump administration, is huge. We don't have to pass bills into law for policy change. And there are countless differences between the US-Israel and US-Saudi relations. But Hassan told me that people were saying the same thing then as they were saying now, which is, don't even try or bother to change this relationship. It's impossible. There's stakeholders, there's money. The uphill battle is so steep. No one cares about Yemenis. That's what they were hearing then. So now we know the tools, and we know the tools to use, the JRDs, the war powers, the letters, to help members speak out for a ceasefire, for no weapons to Israel, for a deal to release the hostages and Palestinian prisoners, for humanitarian aid and UNRWA. So that's kind of the precedent in the Yemen case. And now I'm going to talk about what we've been doing around the Israel-Palestine case. The ceasefire hadn't happened for months and months and months. And in January, this is 3-4 months into the war, we helped push Senator Sanders to force a vote on a bill that would require the State Department investigate how its weapons are being used by Israel and if they're being used to violate human rights. This was a moment where lawmakers made history by centering for the first time ever Palestinian human rights during a debate and vote on the Senate floor. The majority of senators voted against this resolution, and it would have increased accountability and addressed US direct complicity in human rights violations committed in Gaza, but it did not pass. Nonetheless, the resolution, this is SRES 504. I'm going to send this bill website in the chat as well if you want to read more about it. Sponsored by Sanders, invoked Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. And though it's rarely used, this law requires, like I said, the State Department to submit a report to Congress within 30 days on the human rights conditions of a country to which the US is providing aid or military equipment. If the government fails to comply, or if the country in question exhibits a pattern of gross human rights violation, the law prohibits US to provide weapons to that country. The number of votes that we got in favor of this bill was 12. It feels meager, but I'm reminding you this is the first time in US history that Congress held a vote that would somehow condition weapons to Israel. That had never happened before. So then, after months more of war, about 10 months later, we had the UNRWA bills introduced in this interim period. We were pushing for public statements for a ceasefire. But November 20th, a year later, Congress And this in response to the administration notifying of humongous billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons sales, Congress held its first ever vote to block offensive weapons sales to Israel. Senators voted on 3 joint resolutions of disapproval that Sanders introduced to prevent the sale of specific offensive weapons used in well-documented violations and war crimes in Gaza. And these did not pass, but 19 senators this time voted in favor of the bills, marking a significant milestone for a growing movement to end unconditional US support for Israel. The results of these JRDs show the power of the movement. I'm telling you, when I say we were up against these powers investing millions, AIPAC invested more in the anti-JRD campaign than they had on any other vote in their history. President Biden called members of Congress personally on their phones and said, vote against these bills. That is a rare occasion. And we still got 19 senators, almost 20% of the Senate, to vote in favor of blocking offensive weapons to Israel for the first time in US history. So we also compelled senators who had avoided the issue to take a public stance and go on the record in a way that will be documented in history. The vote shattered the kind of glass ceiling on US-Israel relations. And although the fight to end this support is far from over, the momentum, I would say, is undeniable. Most recently, in early April, we suffered a bit of a fall in numbers when votes were held on 2 more JRDs. These JRDs, in response to Trump's announced sales of weapons of JDAMs and 500-pound bombs and the brutal 2,000-pound bombs used in mass civilian harm. And these had 15 votes in favor of those, as opposed to the previous 19 votes. Some of the votes we lost were Ossoff and Warnock of Georgia. We think it's because of the upcoming elections and they feel like it is too much of a political risk. We lost a couple of senators who are no longer senators, and we gained Andy Kim of New Jersey, which is a win. We also saw AIPAC invest millions to unseat members of Congress. Those are Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. Successfully, they unseated those 2 people. So there's so much against our efforts. And still we got these votes, so we are pushing forward. Another thing I'll mention, and this is between us, okay? Sanders forced this vote without letting our coalition know in advance so that we could, mobilize these people around the vote. We had hundreds of thousands of advocates working on this and thousands coming to the Senate to advocate their members to vote in favor of last vote. Sanders told us a week in advance that he's forcing the vote. And as you know, and I admire you all for coming to this call greatly, there's so much going on right now in the United States domestically. So having the energy, the grassroots energy to push for these votes was really hard, and still we got 15 votes. I still count this as a win of sorts, but we have so much work to do. And then I'm going to move us into the present day, and first acknowledge that I need reflections like Greg's reflection. I need faith leaders like you all. I need my community here at home to uplift the spirits and provide hope in these really dark, grim times, because it feels like under the Trump administration, there's only so much we can do. But I'm here in Baltimore as part of the JVP convention. I'm so inspired by people who weren't even raised in the area where I was raised, didn't even suffer this violence directly on their own skin, and feel so compelled to move and shine light on humanity and the deep rooted knowledge that there is another way. And so I'm kind of acknowledging that this is the state that I am in right now as we move forward with this Congress facing work. So one thing that we are working on right now, and it's the most pressing and urgent of them all, is to push members of Congress to call for opening of aid to Gaza. People are being starved very deliberately with support from the United States. Allowing humanitarian aid it's not a question. It's not even it's being used as a bargaining chip, which is a war crime, but it is every human being's right. And so we're trying to get members of Congress on the record calling for opening of humanitarian aid. Recently, Representatives Carbajal and Ami Bera are leading a letter. This is close hold because it's not public yet, but to the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Yechiel Leiter, with a carbon copy sent to Secretary of State Rubio, urging the Israeli government to resume allowing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. We're hoping to get over 100 members of Congress to sign this letter, send it over. And, having constant lobby visits, calls, get your member, tweet something, make a public statement, press release. We know of Representative Adam Smith. We're working with him behind closed doors, which he's considered a more moderate Democrat, to talk about this as well. And then another issue that we've been pushing for is the students and the human rights defenders and the protesters who have just opened their voice to try and end U.S. complicity in the genocide. We recently helped gather signatures for a letter that Representative Jayapal led to Secretaries Rubio and Noam, demanding answers about reports that the Department of State is revoking students' visas without transparency, and that ICE is terminating students' legal status. The letter is seeking information about all these student revocations and the legal authority, which legal authority is allowing for these revocations and terminations to even happen. The letter is also requesting information on the use of AI and the specific criteria and processes that are being used to identify students in the first place for visa revocation and termination of their legal status. So, amid working on these issues, we're also seeing organizations around us, primarily Palestinian-run organizations, targeted for anti-Semitism, targeted for terror support, targeted for submitting evidence to the International Criminal Court on Israel's war crimes being carried out in Gaza. And seeing these organizations suffer and take hits, we at FCNL, as well as our entire coalition, know that we need to stand in solidarity with each other. If one of us is injured, all of us is injured. And we're trying to work as well with organizations across various issues, whether it be immigration rights, whether it be human rights, health, environment, LGBTQ, different faith groups, feminist groups. It's so intertwined, all of these issues together. And so, in these dark, dire times, I've been really inspired by how collectivist I see we are, how I believe under the last Trump administration, where I wasn't in the United States to experience, organizations learned that they have to stand together and created platforms in order for them to be able to push back on these issues collectively and in solidarity with each other. And then finally, what I want to share is what you can do if you're interested in regards to this issue. So we do have call and email actions that we are constantly asking people to continue taking. I know Rick shared some links in the invitation as well, and I can share those here on the chat as well. We are coming out with a new action alert on these humanitarian aid efforts, calling your member of Congress to demand that humanitarian aid be allowed to enter Gaza. And we also have these advocacy teams nationwide. We have 2 advocacy teams in California, where I believe most of you are from, but you can join an advocacy team. And you can also join as a faith leader that doesn't have to be affiliated with FCNL. But we've noticed that when faith leaders come to these meetings, it provides all the more credibility and representation of entire communities in one's district or state. So if you want to join an advocacy team, or learn more about the advocacy teams, I will send you a couple links, and Tim Heichman's email, who is the facilitator and coordinator of advocacy teams nationwide that you can reach and try and join these efforts. I've seen, as a lobbyist who goes to these meetings on a near daily basis, when a staffer has heard from constituents before, they are so much more inclined to listen and follow through, as opposed to when I can give them the most rational, informed information and arguments to why they should support this bill, why they should lead this letter. But if they have a constituent group that's demanding them to do this, that's putting real pressure on them, they are all the more likely to carry out this action we're asking them to make. And then I think what you're doing now, learning and diving in, waking up early on a Friday morning to listen to some person yap for 2 hours, I'm really in awe of how invested you all seem to be already. So without further ado, I'd like to open for questions, comments, anything you want to bring forth. And thank you so much for this platform to share with you today.
Odeliya, thank you. What an extraordinary presentation right from the start. We're so grateful for you sharing your personal situation, what sounds like a struggle within your own family over these issues. Very important to us. We've all been trying to navigate that in many different ways. I'm brimming with questions. People will begin to raise their electronic hands, and I will pace myself. I did, from a practical standpoint, want to ask a few things. Did you say that Adam Schiff is persuadable? You said Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. So Adam Smith we're trying to get him to lead a statement individually because he won't jump on the Carvajal Amibera letter.
I see. You're trying to invoke his invisible hand from his forebear.
Exactly.
But I wanted you to take a few minutes for the group to talk about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and the elevation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has been so corrosive to the discussion and to the conflation of virulent, hateful anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. It's an issue this group has focused on a lot. I have written extensively on that issue. I understand in the last 48 hours or so, we had some success in the Senate in blunting the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. I don't know if that's going to last. It passed the House with Democratic support. So for the benefit of the group, tell us about the AAA and the IHRA definition.
Of course, yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. And this is, part of that pattern I was talking about. Fellow organizations are being targeted for anti-Semitism on the premise of the IHRA or the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. This definition of anti-Semitism, what it does is it ultimately conflates anti-Zionism, critical speech on Israel, with anti-Semitism. To me, by the way, that is in and of itself an anti-Semitic trope, to think that all Jews should support Israel. In order to be Jewish, you need to be Zionist. There's so many examples of Jewish people who don't comply with those values. And in a sense, if that's your logic, Donald Trump is more Jewish than I am. And so I completely disagree with the IRA definition. Another thing that's really important in the IRA definition is it calls, if I compare Nazi Germany to the Israeli government, that will lead me to be anti-Semitic. Now, I watched the hearing a couple days ago in the Senate Judiciary Committee on this specific bill. As you said, it wasn't voted on. The vote will be deferred to another time. What I found was the greatest argument made was by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's a Republican libertarian. And he said the following: I believe in freedom of speech. Often I disagree with people. I see people who disagree with someone, and when you deeply disagree with someone, you'll compare him to the worst person you know in history, which is often Hitler. Calling Israel, this one country, you can't compare Israel to the Nazi regime. And he said, I disagree with this comparison, but you cannot block the comparison of one entity and completely annihilate the freedom of speech because of this one entity cannot be compared to another entity. Furthermore, that was Rand Paul's statement in the Senate committee, and I thought that was really well said. Another thing I wanted to say is, like I told you, 6 hours of my 60-hour course I was teaching was dedicated to the Holocaust and the rise of fascism. Because I taught this information, it was so clear to me how similar the toolbook being used by the Israeli government and the toolbook that was used by the Nazi regime are. And it is heartbreaking that the Jewish people, not as a whole, but that the government that calls itself a Jewish government is instilling the same playbook that was used upon us. I've seen teaching 18-year-olds as the part of teaching fellow, the Forum for Regional Thinking. I was teaching 18-year-olds in these pre-army gap years about critical thought, exposing them to Palestinian narratives and Palestinian speakers and lecturers, and trying to get them to reconsider whether or not they should join a military. The 18-year-olds that I was teaching would come in with the most vile opinions I've ever heard, complete dehumanizing rhetoric. And it was far beyond the death to Arab statements that I was hearing in my classroom. They were thinking of how to completely transfer all Palestinians from their homes as the only feasible solution to the problem that was going on. So I was raised, and around me, I'm hearing rhetoric that echoed rhetoric I would see in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, that I'd been to 12 times in my military service. Basically, not being able to compare the two is an abomination to the truth. And so that's what the IRA definition is asking the Senate to do. And according to this definition as well, organizations that do violate the anti-Semitism IRA definition will be subject to incredible violations of their own organizations. It could be stripped from tax exempt status. Their, executive directors and employees could be criminalized. So there are really dire consequences if this bill passes.
Thank you. I quickly want to add that the very draftsman of the IHRA definition, Kenneth Stern, has testified that he never intended his definition to become legislation, that he never intended the examples in it to be used to punish free speech. This is the very author of that. And yet Harvard, despite its courage in many ways, has adopted the IRA definition in its policing of anti-Semitism and other organizations. It is a very dangerous trend. I'm delighted. And I want to say generally as chair that we stand with you. We have valued the work of FCNL for decades. Offline, I want to work with you and our board of directors to heighten our work on these precise issues, because it's a domestic way of fighting the battles that are going on in the Middle East. And it's some area where an interfaith group like ours can have a real impact. But this is such an opportune time for me to turn to Anthony Manousis, who has been our liaison to FCNL. Thank you for joining us. Briefly introduce yourself, Anthony, and make your comment.
So yes, I'm Anthony Manousis, and I want to apologize for being a little late. I've been traveling and I was jet lagged this morning and I couldn't get up early enough to catch the beginning. but I'm so happy this is going to be recorded because I want to hear every word that you've said. This is a really impressive presentation that you've given, and I'm really grateful. I work with the advocacy team here in California. I know Chris Gutierrez and others. I think they visited Adam Schiff's office not long ago, a couple of weeks ago. And I'm eager to see our group have a meeting with our state senators. Can you give us any advice on which senators would be best to meet with and what issue they might be most persuadable about?
Are you talking about California in
Yeah.
particular?
Yeah. In other words, Schiff and Badia.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Have we met before, by the way, Anthony?
I think we probably have. A couple of years ago, I went to the annual session in DC, and I think I met you there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Padilla has been a rough office. The staffers seem, what has often been the case with our work in the last year and a half is that the staffer is more informed, or the staffer stands with us on many issues, and then it's a matter of getting them to persuade their boss to take a step forward. I real quick trying to find the list of, so your representative is, who's your representative, your district representative?
My district representative is Judy Chu.
Judy
and
Chu.
She's been very good.
Yeah.
Just a little, one minute, we in Pasadena were able to organize a very effective lobby to convince our city council to approve a resolution calling for a ceasefire, return of hostages, and expedited humanitarian aid. We had 600 people show up for a special called meeting at the Pasadena Convention Center. 200 people spoke. Very powerful.
Wow.
We had been pressuring Judy for a long time. She's actually more sympathetic to Palestine than most in the Congress, but she wouldn't take a real strong stand until after this vote by the city council. And then she was one of 50 Congress members to vote against military aid to Israel. So, we made some progress, but took a lot of pushing to get her there.
Thank you. Thank you for your hard work. No, Judy Chu I feel like she's also become more better with time, and I'm sure that has to do with advocacy work. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I would say, okay, you have Padilla and you have Schiff. Schiff is the very narrow perspectivist that we see in a lot of the Democratic Party, especially among more moderate Dems. And this is something I've raised with his office before. I think his top priority here, the thing he cares the most about, is the hostage release from Gaza. Israeli hostages being released from Gaza. What I would suggest, and I'm putting together, I can send a Hebrew article in the chat. All I'm asking is for you to Google translate it, and you could send it to the office or request a meeting and talk about this. When food doesn't enter Gaza, hostages are not eating either. I just went back to Jerusalem to visit for 2 weeks. My best friend's cousin was a hostage who was released. And I asked her what the conversation was with him when he left. And he told his family they weren't eating much at all. But the worst period of time for him in captivity was the first 100 days. And if you remember, that was when Israel instated a total blockade on Gaza. So that isn't written down in an article. I'm trying to get folks who've been released from captivity to be more outspoken on that. But I will send an article in the chat that you can use and bring this up if you do get a meeting with either Schiff or Padilla. And you can say, the Hostages Family Forum as well is calling for a ceasefire and a negotiation and a deal to release the hostages. Hostages have also testified that they were most scared of Israeli airstrikes when in captivity. And we think about a third of the hostages who were kidnapped to begin with died because of Israeli airstrikes. So even from, what I believe Senator Schiff's very narrow perspective would compel him to do, is to talk about you need to allow food in, and you need a ceasefire and a negotiation to release the hostages. I also, Padilla is one of the senators whose staffers were stronger on our side than the senator was. But maybe they could lead a letter on the humanitarian aid situation, or kind of push fellow colleagues in the Senate to really talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and how the US needs to demand the allowance of humanitarian aid in. We were expecting the political calculus to change under the Trump administration so that more people could be outspoken, kind of making demands from the administration when they hadn't under Biden. So this could be a kind of window where Padilla and Schiff would make that step. And then one more thing I wanted to say on this topic, because there's so much chaos, because the administration is flooding the zone with so many breaches and violations and destruction, what I have noticed is when advocates come into an office and say, I still care about Gaza, you need to move on this issue, it's even more powerful than before, because they notice that of the bandwidth that you have, you are focusing on this issue. That's really powerful. And that if you are meeting with the office, Anthony, you should mention, I care about this and this and this and this. But I want to focus today on Gaza because the humanitarian situation is so devastating still, and you need to move harder on this issue. I hope those are valuable tools for you. And I'll add my email in the chat if you do schedule a meeting, or if you want to chat and prepare for a meeting that we can schedule. I'm happy to join the meeting or help your team prepare ahead of time.
This is enormously helpful. I just want to say I appreciate your pragmatic approach, because many of us are just so appalled we don't know where to begin. And I think your approach makes sense to me, because we have to take this one step at a time, as we did in Pasadena, to get to the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're going to get to your question, Ruby, next. I think ICUJP has been very good at these lobby visits, at organizing delegations, and I think Padilla, we have the greatest chance of influencing. I think your approach, that there's the humanitarian issue and there's the free speech issue. And I saw Padilla at a hands-off national event expressing how troubled he is by Mahmoud Khalil's detention and the students that are being detained. And he related it to the right of free speech and the right of protest. So I think that's an entry point on the question of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and IRA to move people. And then as you move them on that, you get them to talk about Palestine and the right of Palestinian sovereignty in the name of free speech. And then when you add the humanitarian component, I think it's a forceful argument. So we'll work with you offline on exactly this approach. And I know Padilla from early work years ago. So that's important. I have a few more questions, but let me, as we move toward wrapping up, I will come full circle. Some of us are debating these issues within our own families, in circles of friends. It has been, I know it's been particularly difficult for Jews to talk about the genocide. Can I ask you how you discuss that within your family? You mentioned your father's approach that I think you were alluding to, contrasts with your mother's and perhaps your own. How do we find common ground on these issues? How do we appeal to fundamental values, both of human rights generally and of Jewish values, which have taught us to care for the stranger and to believe in justice. So as you begin to wrap up your remarks, and again, I don't want to invade your privacy or cross any lines here, but you live in a space that probably in one way or another is emblematic of a lot of families that are debating these tough issues. So give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Whew, that, it's a question I'm pondering today. So I just came back for 2 weeks in Jerusalem and the region to have Seder, the Passover Seder. This annual ceremony, my family takes very seriously. We have a 6-hour session. We read, we pray, we sing, we eat, we drink wine, and we talk about liberation in my family space. Myself, my sister, and one other cousin, when we talk about liberation, we include Palestinians, and the rest of the family does not. And some of them are very contrarian, or very violent in the rhetoric towards Palestinians. So we're sitting at this big table, and I decided this year to not bring up anything political unless I'm asked questions. And then I was asked questions, and I shared that I tried to establish some consensus ahead of the things I was sharing about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. That was my focus with my Israeli family, some very Zionist, some very right-wing Zionist. First, I asked them, do you believe the Israeli government has your best interests at hand? No one in my family supports Netanyahu. They support right-wingers, they support left-wingers, but they don't support Netanyahu. He only cares for himself, and that is quite obvious to the majority of Israelis. Okay, next. Does Netanyahu have the priorities lives at the utmost importance? Everyone agreed he does not. Next. Does Netanyahu have control of the narrative in the Israeli media? And everyone agreed that yes, he does. Next. So now we have reached this consensus. Here's what I'm hearing in international media. Here's what I'm hearing from doctors who serve there on the ground. Here's what I'm reading international and Israeli security experts say. This is the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And then I got pushback. But Hamas is taking all the humanitarian aid. But this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And as this rhetorical tool, what I basically said was, consider that not all the information you're reading, like we had addressed earlier, is the truth. Consider that what I'm telling you right now is the truth. Is it right or is it wrong that Israel is blocking all aid into Gaza? And the entire family agreed that it is wrong. So I tried to kind of, I recognize, first, I try and recognize people's fear. Being an Israeli right now, there are, in the United States, we're seeing in Congress, we're seeing in mainstream media, that experience is being amplified all the time, with Palestinians' experience not being amplified at all. But being an Israeli in Israel right now, it's not easy either. Living in a country at war is not easy for anyone, whether you're the perpetrator of the war, the victim of the genocide. It's not easy for anyone. So I try to address their fear, address what they care about the most. What they care about the most is being safe. My family has Holocaust survivors in our lineage. They feel like now we finally have a piece of land where we're safe. Never, ever give that up. That's a sentiment that they're coming with. So I have to acknowledge their real fear, their sometimes existential fear. The loss. One of my cousin's best friend was murdered on October 7th, and my entire family was at this devastating funeral. They carry that every day. Another friend of mine, her best friend's brother is a hostage. She carries that every day with her. So I really had to show people that I'm not undermining any of these fears, any of these hurts that you're experiencing, but consider that I'm not lying to you right now, that I'm telling you the truth, that I've done my research, that I love you guys, and I also am smart and wise enough to understand when I'm being told the truth and when I'm not being told the truth. Consider that I'm telling the truth. We need to stop this from happening. And I felt like, unfortunately, like we're at the point where Israel is starving millions of people. I don't think that when people understand that that is exactly what is happening, that it is good for Israeli security and well-being. We can't in our conscious right minds believe that to be the truth. And if I saw people in my family agreeing with that, I don't think I could talk to them anymore. For me, it's a red line when someone says it's okay to murder millions of innocent civilians. And so here's my make it that long kind of response short. It's twofold. One is know when to draw your line. If you can't have a conversation with someone, if it feels unsafe to have a conversation with someone, it's okay, I think. On the other hand, I would say acknowledge people's real fear, and they're not faking it. They really, really care. They really, really are hurting. The hostages, it's painful for them daily. Like the October 7th is really painful for them. And then from that place forward, with that acknowledgement, what is happening now cannot continue. Do you agree or disagree? And try to establish that consensus. Then maybe we can work together.
You know, in just 3 minutes, you really said so much there that talks to how do we talk to folks about this and other issues. And ICUJP has struggled with that for 24 years over a range of issues. And your guidance is so helpful. Do you feel at your Seder or in private conversations thereafter, did you reach anyone? Do you think you opened some minds?
Yes, I did. I have one cousin who is an intelligence reservist. She was really hard on me when I first came in, really hard. And she condemned in front of others my work trying to block offensive weapons to Israel. She said it's hurting our soldiers. By the end of the conversation, and I told her, if you have a better solution to pressure the Israeli government, let me know and I'll stop doing what I'm doing. And she couldn't come up with any other solution. So that, I feel like I try not to be vain or boast too often, but I think that my family trained me how to be a pretty good lobbyist. That I feel confident in. But that conversation, it was moving because she also really shared how much suffering she's been going through this year and how much she cares about the hostages. It is constantly on her mind. And I love her. And I think she's a wonderful person. And that the fact that her view is really narrow and doesn't include Palestinians, on one hand, can be really disturbing. On the other hand, it's hard to have the capacity to care that much about so many people. But we reached similar conclusions at the end, and she no longer condemns the work that I do, which is a step.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for pushing the boulder up the mountain in so many ways, including with your family. It's maybe the toughest conversations we can have. We're so grateful for you today. The group is aware that at this moment, I offer you to be a card-carrying member of ICUJP. Your lifetime membership is paid in full. We hope with a better change of time in the morning that you will join us in the future as a speaker in the next several months and later this year. We'd love to have you back to update us on what you're doing, the successes you've had, the struggles. And I've already said that offline, we're going to work together on several of the issues that you brought to us today. We love your kindness, your big heart, the way you approach these issues. I think we can all tell you have a big impact on the people that you're meeting with and speaking with. FCNL is lucky to have you. We're lucky to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Those are the kindest words ever. I've also just special thanks to Rick for your patience with me, for organizing this, putting it together, Steve, and all you guys. I'm again, you didn't grow up there and you care so much. That is so deeply moving. So appreciate the space, the time, and hope to see you all again.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Stay with us as long as you can till the conclusion. Rick.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank Anthony for bringing
And
you into our circle and letting us know. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to say how grateful I am that you were here today. I don't think I've ever heard a better, I never heard a better presentation than yours. I'm saying that seriously because I struggle with the same things, how to have these conversations and how to approach it. And what you said was so helpful. Thank you.
Daniel, please send us off.
Let us pray. Holy being, we acknowledge your presence among us, and we acknowledge that all people in the world do not have to believe the same thing or believe in divinity at all. We acknowledge that that the intrinsic worth of humans is such that by virtue of them simply being alive, they are vested with intrinsic worth. By simply being the earth itself and the planets, they have intrinsic worth, not for what they can be profited from, not by how they can be exploited, but just by the fact that they are in existence. And holy being, we thank you for all of that. We are so grateful for Odeliya's presence and her embodiment of humility and strength at the same time, and profound intelligence and passion for truth, for compassion, and for the dignity of every human being. We ask that Jose's time before the authorities, that he be surrounded and protected by your love, by your encouragement, and that you hold up Jose's dignity simply because he's a human being. We ask for help in all of our work as we proceed to strive for justice, for peace, and the deeper meaning of all that is. We ask for your blessing for our Climate Justice Now event this coming Sunday, which is bringing together Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others, and atheists into a space of telling the truth about climate-fueled disasters and doing something about it by changing the system and calling to account those who are polluting the earth and creating the climate crisis. We thank you for this space and for going out into the world in peace today with courage and love. Let us say all, Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Daniel. So grateful. Thank you, Odelia, so much. Thank you, Greg, for your reflection. Thanks for every one of you for being here. Do something kind today. Do something to advance human dignity. Interfaith communities named itself because we have such a broad definition of faith. It is everything that's been mentioned and humanists as well. So do well, be safe this weekend, do something for justice, do something for love and caring for others. And we will promise you a program next Friday. You will see an announcement next week. And please join us. Thank you so much, everybody.